Welcome to the Analytic Christian. I'm Jordan, and this is the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. We've reached the fourth and final interview with Dan Speak. Thank you so much, Dan, for joining me a fourth time.
My pleasure.
This interview is going to be all about theodicies. So, when we discussed the logical problem of evil, the evidential and divine hiddenness, we focused on a defense as a response. But now we're shifting to theodicies. So the question we want to ask right up front is, what is a theodicy? And you may want to explain once more how that's different than a defense.
Good. Yeah, let me return to an example, right? The example that sometimes helps me to think about the difference between defense and theodicy is to think again about a court case in a U.S. court of law, where the prosecution's job is to show to the jury, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the person has committed the crime. And then what a defendant has to do is just the defendant doesn't, strictly speaking, have to prove they're innocent, right? They don't have to make it plausible that they're innocent. All they have to do is make it plausible that the prosecution has not made their case, right? And so one way to think about this parallel here is that a defense is an effort by the theist to show that some atheological argument, maybe it's the logical problem, maybe it's the evidential problem, maybe it's the problem of divine hiddenness, a defense will just be an effort to show, look, atheologian, I don't think you've made your case sufficiently, right? Does that mean that this person has shown that God has good reasons for allowing the world's evils? No, right? Because a defense just shows, I don't think that argument that you've just produced has demonstrated that, say, God doesn't exist. But now, look, someone in a court case, you can imagine a defendant who's like not happy with the fact that their defense team just attacks the case, the proof of the case, because the defendant's like, but I'm innocent. I want to show that I'm innocent. What would you have to do in that case? Well, then you'd have to make it plausible that you haven't committed the crime in question, right? So now applied to theodicy, the theodicy, if a defense is just the effort on the part of the theist to show that a certain atheological argument has not made its case against theism, a theodicy is a more dramatic effort. Theodicy's effort is to show that it's plausible that God has good reasons for permitting each of the evils that our world actually contains. So that the person who's offering a theodicy is trying to show that it's likely that one of the premises of the atheological argument, it's likely that one of them is false, right? Trying to show, hey, that premise is false. I've got good reasons for thinking that premise is false. I've got good reasons for thinking that God would be morally justified in permitting each of these evils. And doing that's much harder. On my view, any theodicy, anything that succeeds in showing that God does in fact have good reasons for allowing each instance of evil, is going to have to do so by, I've got these two claims behind me here, is going to have to do it by making each of these claims plausible. Hear what I'm saying when I say plausible. I mean more likely true than false. Right? It's not enough for these to be possibly true. That was okay in certain versions of defense, right? But that's not good enough in theodicy, because in theodicy we're now vindicating God. We're showing that God has morally justifying reasons for allowing even the world's horrors. And in order to do that, each of these claims will have to be made plausible. Okay, so here's the claims. The first one's the value claim. And so it looks like the person who's offering a theodicy has to show this, that a world containing these goods or comparable ones, I'm eliding that, but or comparable ones, and these evils, whatever they are, is better than any world that didn't have either of those. So that somehow the existence of these evils, even along, is in some respects justified by the fact that it's in connection with these goods. Okay, so that's the value claim, that whatever the evils are, they're sort of, the big point is they're worth it. The theodicist has to show that they're worth it, right? And then The impossibility claim, again, to the level of plausibility, would have to be shown this, that it was impossible for God to secure a world containing these goods without also ending up with these evils, right? So it's got to be impossible, because we're talking about God being, this is the omni God. This is the God in which all of the omnis hold. So it's got to be that God's constrained by something like impossibility in order for it to work. So theodicy is a big project, right? You got to try to show that God in fact does have good reasons, and what they are for all of the instances by meeting these conditions.
Yeah, that seems like a really tall task. So
Right.
let's look in the literature. What are some of the most prominent goods
Yeah.
that contemporary philosophers have appealed to? Because looking at that value claim and that impossibility claim, it's largely about, hey, God's trying to get these goods, and the
Yes.
evils are worth it, essentially. So
That's right.
what are some of these most prominent ones in the literature?
Yeah, good. And there really are nearly countless. Okay, but let's think about three that seem to have formed the core of almost every effort at theodicy. The first one, of course, is free will. We already saw that in response as a part of the defense in planning his case. But if you leverage it up, right, you can see how you can try to get a theodicy going with free will by thinking about the value and the impossibility claim. Why would free will be so valuable? Well, it would have to be that there are these things that depend on free will that are immensely valuable. Maybe free will in itself is just intrinsically valuable. I have an instinct about that, but it also makes other things possible. Moral responsibility on one claim, certain forms of human intimacy, right? Certain forms of intimacy between God and persons, perhaps, right? And those things can start to ramp up and seem like, okay, maybe those are the kinds of things that are so valuable that having those is important enough that even though you end up with a lot of really bad things, maybe those things, maybe it's worth it, right? Like that. And then how do you get the impossibility claim? Well, look, it looks like you need to have something like libertarian free will. You have to have the kind of free will such that God couldn't cause you to do all of the right things all of the time. Like it has to be a genuinely open possibility that you will really screw things up, and so that there's a kind of metaphysical impossibility to God just making a world in which everyone does everyone does the right freely. So freedom, as it were, requires that possibility, and then you're close to seeing how maybe freedom could be one of the contributors to it's not going to go all the way. Everyone should see that, right? I mean, so free will is an important story, part of every theodic story, but it can't do the whole thing, right? And things come immediately to mind, right? Natural evils, bad things happening to animals, situations in which it doesn't look like freedom is involved at all, and yet bad things happen. So free will can't do it all, but it goes some distance, right? Let me just keep going on these.
Yeah, I'll just plug this one interview. I meant to plug it back when we did the logical problem.
Yeah.
But on that note, so I interviewed Kenny Boyce.
Yeah.
And he has this paper where he argues that free will can explain natural evil. It's a very provocative
Yes.
proposal. So I'll just put that interview in the video
Nice.
so people can click on it and watch if they're interested. But yeah, I think it's very plausible to me that free will is not going to account for natural evil. So what are some of the other goods?
Good. And I'll just say I don't know what Kenny's paper is on that, but maybe it's related to Peter Van Inwagen has this view that one way you can think it went is
I think I made an animated video on Peter Van Inwagen's view.
yeah.
Would this be fair to say that he tells this story and he says, well, for all we know, that could be the story. And the story is basically something like this, God, through the evolutionary process, these humans are formed. God puts them in a kind of paradise state, but they freely choose to separate themselves from God. And so in order to um, try and draw them back into a relationship with him, he basically permits all sorts of uh, horrible evils so that they know what life separated from him is like. And if he constantly intervened to like stop all their suffering,
Yes.
then they would have no motivation to try and be in relationship with him.
Yes.
So he allows these things to a large degree in order to try and motivate them to want to come back to him and have a restored relationship with him. Is that basically the idea?
That's the kind of thing I was. Yeah. He. Is that how Kenny's thinking about it? He's coming at a different direction.
Kenny goes a Molinist route.
Okay.
It's actually, it may not fit here. I don't think Kenny tries to use it in this kind of theodicy sense. I think Kenny's saying you can take planning as free will defense, and you don't have to. You can account for natural evil on that view, and you don't have to go the whole like demons shift
Nice.
tectonic
I
plates
see.
type
Okay.
of
Yeah.
thing.
Good. I see. Okay. Yeah. Well, interesting stuff. So, it sounds like we're in agreement, though, that like free will is not going to get us everything that a
Yeah, yeah.
theodicy you want a theodicy to get. A second thing, this is deeply related to work by John Hick. Hick developed the idea of soul building theodicy, soul making, where he wasn't thinking about souls in the sort of classical metaphysical sense. He just means the idea of human development, right? And what Hick, and this seems to me to be right, took notice of is that um, it would be reasonable to expect God not to be satisfied with creatures just living in a hedonistic paradise, but that God would want creatures to develop morally, to become more like God's self. And when you start thinking about what a creature would need in order to become to move from the state of what human beings are ordinarily like, what they were like when they first entered into the world, and what they're like when they enter into the world in each individual case, to get to certain levels of maturity, well, they need some obstacles. And so the question, according to Hick, is not, is the world sufficiently filled up with pleasures? The question is the world a reasonable place for beings like ourselves to be formed into the kinds of creatures who become sufficiently like God to enter into life-giving relationship with God? And when you think about that, then you think, well, look, you might need some garbage, right? If you think about some of the crucial properties we would have to have, you think about like becoming compassionate, right? It looks like in order to become compassionate, there has to be some suffering for you to feel compassion towards. If you're going to have courage, right, you're going to have to encounter some genuinely fearful things, and etc. And so that in the sort of a fundamental way, Hick's thought is our character development needs some obstacles that will constitute maybe natural evils. And so, what's the value claim? Well, the value claim here is, well, a world containing the possibility of human beings becoming genuinely morally good in the full blown, theistic sense is better. And that contains the natural evils that our world contains, is better than any world that lacked the natural evils, but that also, as a result, lacked the possibilities for genuine moral development. That's the value claim. And then the impossibility claim is just another kind of logical structure, right? That you couldn't, in fact, have the most fundamental kinds of human intimacy if there weren't the possibility of obstacles for us to overcome in them. And you couldn't really have had the most fundamental kind of courage or compassion if there weren't, in fact. So you get it. You again, you get some distance toward a story about why the world contains the evils, right? Um,
Okay.
yeah.
So that's the second good. So the first
Yep.
is his free will. Second one is soul
Soul
building.
making. Yep. Soul
Third
building.
one is what?
Yeah. Third one is the importance of stable natural laws. So, I mean, there's an intrinsic, if you think much about this, you'll find yourself thinking, like, there's a sort of intrinsic beauty to the universe being organized by stable natural laws. It's quite beautiful for all the multifarious aspects of the world, to be ordered under a few, comparatively few, natural laws that can be integrated and make a world that's mathematically and otherwise beautiful. That's good, and you might think that's a good thing in itself. But having stable natural laws makes for other things too, right? Like, so it looks like without stable natural laws, you and I couldn't get any knowledge of the world, really, right? We need the laws to be stable in order for, just think about how ordinary science works. Ordinary science presupposes that the laws are stable enough that we can figure out what's going to happen here and there and learn deep fundamental things about the structure of physical reality. Um, Moral action looks like it requires stable natural laws, right? If the laws of nature aren't stable, I don't know how to help you, right? I mean, I only can help you by leveraging the laws, so that my handing you this food works, or my pulling you out of the pond when you're drowning actually works. And if their laws were totally erratic and unstable, I wouldn't have any way of knowing what it meant for you to be in danger, or how to help you, or what have you. So the claim is, the stability of these natural laws is good in these ways. And now here it gives you a way of thinking about this aspect of the problem of evil. Well, why is it that, for example, there aren't just lots and lots of miracles? Why isn't God just sort of always, intervening, performing? At least most of the traditions act as if there are some miracles. Why isn't there just a crap ton more of them all of the time? Well, here's an answer. If there was a crap ton more of them, the laws of nature would not have the kind of stability that's needed for those other goods, right? We couldn't learn things about the world if we were always in doubt about whether or not, we wouldn't be able to predict the regularities if things were happening miraculously at various points. So it sounds nice that whenever someone parachutes, gravity works, because that's fun. But when a kid falls out of a tree, gravity just sort of gently drops them to the ground. That sounds nice until you start thinking about how you could get around in such a world, what kind of predictions you could make in such a world, and how you could be an agent, and how you could act in such a world when you really let it be that flexible. So the claim is, there's a deep good there, and it looks like another kind of, with respect to the impossibility claim, it looks like another case wherein, look, if God is going to get the goods that are contingent upon that stability, he can't let there be too much flexibility in that system. And so we end up with cases in which some of the evils in the world are going to come about because it's required by the stability of the laws. So those three together, now they're interpenetrating, and they support each other in various ways, as a lot of theodic sort of moves do. But like, see, the package is quite powerful. Value of freedom of the will, value of the formation of our characters in the way that towards godlikeness, and the way that the natural world has to be ordered fairly, quite stably. Together, that accommodates and tells a story about a lot of reasons God would have for permitting a lot of evil.
Okay. Now, so I guess people making a theodicy, they don't just want to make the goods about this life, earthly life.
Good. Yeah.
Because, maybe you could account for this if you appeal to natural laws, but if there's a small child that starves to death due to a war, they don't have time to soul build and all that kind of thing. So often a theodicy is also going to include a component about the afterlife, or eschatology. So what role does eschatology play?
It's a really good question. It's a kind of it's a bone of contention, but you could put it that way, or you could put it as it's a super interesting part of a research program. Almost every prominent theodicist today is taking some stand on eschatology, that is, on what's the ultimate situation for human persons with respect to, say, the afterlife, right? And maybe it's just worth seeing that super smart and interesting people are doing work on all of the around all the edges of this. So Hick himself was a universalist. That is, Hick thought that he could deal with the fundamental problem of evil only by being only by ensuring, building it in, that no human persons are going to be alienated ultimately from God. There's on the Hick view, there is going to be nothing that looks to be the traditional hell. Everyone is going to make it into the beatific vision. And Marilyn Adams looked like she tracked that too. And you can sort of feel the attraction to that view, right? I mean, if you're trying to account for all of the evils in the idea that no one is ever really at eternal stakes, that helps deal with a lot of evils. Just the one you mentioned, a young child dying, right? That's on certain traditions. There's a real disaster, deep fundamental. I mean, it's always a disaster, but it's an especially deep disaster if you think, and that child might be permanently separated from God in some particularly gruesome way. That's an especially gruesome horror. Marilyn Adams thought that the hell was a kind of horror in itself. So Hick, Marilyn Adams, and others, their contributions to theodicy presuppose, I shouldn't say presuppose because they argue for them. Marilyn's especially good at arguing for this, argue for universalism as a feature of the theodicy. But notice, not everyone does that. So like Richard Swinburne, for example, he thinks that there needs to be some post-mortem opportunity for people, especially for people who've had really, really tragic or unfortunate circumstances, like the kind we're thinking about here with the young child, or in some other case, that they'll need post-mortem opportunities to respond to God's love and to decide what they're going to do with their eternal existence. But he also thinks, interestingly, that Swinburne thinks that it wouldn't be good of God to make that go on forever. So people will have to make a decision. They might have a long time after the end of their natural life, but it's not going to be forever. That they're going to have to finalize it. But he also, I think, this might be contestable by folks who know Richard's view better than I do, but I have heard his noises as sounding like he was inclined towards annihilationism about this. So
that's what I think I've seen some quotes from what he's written that it ends up being like some will be annihilated, or
yeah. And I think he's actually kind of cagey about it in some spots, but I think when I've heard him, it has seemed to me that that's what he's gravitating to. So people might get, many people will get some post-mortem opportunity to respond to God, not forever. And then among their options is not a hell, right? But just passing out of existence implicator, right? It's interesting. Eleanor Stump, she does more to make the view what you might think of as something like traditional hell. She wants to defend the view that God could, in fact, be consigning people to hell, but she needs to make that compatible with God's loving them, right? And so, so she does think of it as an eternal state, or she offers this part of her theodicy. It's an eternal state, and the reason God can't annihilate folks on her view is because that would, mean the destruction of an infinitely valuable thing. God's good, so God's not going to destroy an infinitely valuable thing. So he's going to keep everyone in existence forever. But because God also respects free will for those people who don't want to participate in the beatific vision, they're not going to be forced to, right? Now, one thing to see about that view is, so there'll be people, on her view, there can be people who are permanently alienated from God. But, the Dante-esque version where, you're being burned or dragged under molten pits of tar, or it won't be like that. She thinks that wouldn't be loving, right? Oftentimes when you read her talk, but like, you could start to wonder if maybe you and I are in hell, right? I mean, you might think like, it's like the bad place in the good place, where we're left to our
The consequences of our own choices.
it's definitely the consequences of our own choices, but it might turn out the consequences of our own choices is like I just play a lot of video games forever, right? Which is
Yeah, it reminds me of C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce,
yes,
where it's like you have as much of whatever you want, but it turns out that what you want actually makes you miserable.
exactly.
But you keep you're the one deciding, and
Yeah.
so it's something like that.
I think that's right. Yeah, and then it's a real question on my view. I think it's a genuine question worth your viewers considering. How successful a theodicy, an overarching theodicy, an account of how God, how all of the evils of the world can be morally justified, the permission can be morally justified on those different pictures, right? Of the afterlife, and you can feel the pull towards increasingly sort of permissive, in the book what I call optimistic views. I mean that's a little misleading, right? Because I don't know. I think of the Marilyn and Hick views as maximally optimistic, and then sort of decreasingly optimistic from there down. But
Yeah. Okay. Now, some philosophers actually think that theodicies are themselves an evil. This was new to me when I read your book. I had never heard this type of objection to theodicies, but they want to say to even try to do a theodicy is an evil in itself.
yeah,
How does that go?
I think I can kind of sometimes get into the spirit of feeling it. Okay, I mean, one thing that it looks like we're doing, especially when you think about the value and the impossibility claim, is that the person who attempts a theodicy is attempting to justify God in permitting the evil, to give reasons why God permits the evil. And when the evil is a real horror, a horror on the order of, the way Marilyn Adams would talk about a horror, remember her account of a horror is an, an evil that makes us prima facie suspicious that the person's life was no longer a great good to him or her on the whole, right? So there are horrors, there are kinds of suffering that look like they absolutely destroy the meaning of a life, right? And what some of these anti-theodicist folks can feel is if you enter into the account of a horror and you start providing God with reasons for allowing that, you thereby minimize that thing. It must not be as bad as it looks if God's willing to allow it. So if there is a morally justifying reason for God to allow it, it's not really as bad as all that. And that people will sometimes feel is already to make a moral mistake, right? To have downgraded the seriousness with which we're treating people's suffering of horrors. Another version of this that's got some traction depending on your moral outlook is, isn't God any version of theodicy that takes on something like this looks like it's using people's suffering for some greater good. And if you've got any Kantian impulses, if you're attracted to the idea that we can't use rational nature as means, but have to always treat them as ends in themselves. Some people worry that just offering a theodicy is already in itself to allow people to be treated as mere means, their suffering as mere means and not as ends in themselves. And then there's a sort of broad sort of concern that a lot of anti-theodicists have that that there's something unacceptably anthropomorphizing merely in engaging in the process of doing the justifying, as if God needs to be justified and whatever. God's not the kind of being that requires any justification for anything God does. So you're already bringing God sort of into this kind of moral discussion with us in ways that are not appropriate to God. So those are sort of some of the impulses towards the anti-theodicist in the anti-theodicist literature. I myself feel like I've learned a lot from those folks, but the thing I feel like I've learned is not to stop doing theodicy per se, but to recognize those things as like serious constraints on good theodicy. One of the things I always loved about Marilyn Adams' work was her profound commitment to not addressing the problem of evil in any way that would minimize the suffering of people. And so she was always at pains. She was always at great pains to make sure that however she was responding didn't make the evil less than it really was. I think that's an important message, and it's an important message that the anti-theodicist folks are rightly bringing out. Do I think that every effort to provide reasons that God might have for allowing them minimized human suffering? I don't think that, but I think that some ways of trying to account for it minimizes it. And so one takeaway is don't do that. Always have your ear open to the possibility that the way you're doing theodicy is making the evil less bad than it really is, and don't do that, right? Similarly, don't have a theodicy that uses people unless you're already really committed to the consequentialism, right? Unless you've got a really good story about the consequentialism already, don't do that. And, of course, listen to the good advice to not overly anthropomorphize God. It's a powerful danger, especially, among low church Protestants like myself. So there's good advice in all these cases, but it doesn't seem to me to add up to stop doing theodicy.
Okay. Now, do you think, this was new to me as well, there were several new things in the chapter. Do you think that theists need a theodicy to be rational?
Yeah, I don't. But I think I can feel the force of why someone like Richard Swinburne thinks we do, right? So Swinburne, his friends call him Swinny. I don't think I'm a friend, so I probably can't say that. But Swinburne, how far you want to go into this, Jordan? Let's see. He thinks that there are some evils that when we encounter them, they will seem to us. This is all of us. This is not non-theists. This is every person. He thinks there are some evils that we encounter that will seem to us that they could not have been permitted by a loving God. That's how they will seem. And then Swinburne's deeply committed to this principle of credulity. He thinks that if I'm actually quite attracted to the epistemology in general. That is, he thinks if something seems to you to be the case, then in the absence of defeaters, it's reasonable for you to believe it, right? It's probably true. You should believe it if it seems to you that that's the case and you don't have defeaters. And so he thinks since it does, it will in fact seem to many people that there are evils that could not have been permitted by a loving God. Then you better provide defeaters in the form of a theodicy for those, or they ought to believe that there's no God. And so such people need a theodicy. Look, there's a lot in that's really worth thinking about. And I especially like the way that way of thinking about the evils takes seriously the phenomenology of our encounters with evil. I really respect that. At the same time, it does seem to me to go too far. I mean, I hope I'm not violating my own injunction that I was just giving before, but that was the insight from the anti-theodicists, when I say that I don't think I know what it would mean really for an evil to seem like it couldn't have been allowed by a loving God. I think I can see what it means for me to encounter a horror and think that's mind-numbingly bad. That's wholly destructive of human personality. Etc. I think those things.
Yeah, I think the strongest my seeming would be like, I have absolutely no idea how God would allow that and be loving.
Yes.
It's mind blowing that happened. That's the kind of seeming I could have, but I haven't yet anyway had the seeming, and maybe somebody says, well, you just need to get out more or something, but I haven't yet had the seeming of there's no way that a loving God could allow that.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, Jordan. And it just feels like it's asking too much of our seemings, right? I mean, I get if someone says, um, it seems to me that there's a book on the table, and that's a good reason for you to think there's a book on the table. But suppose someone says, well, it seems to me there's a book on the table and it couldn't have been put there by space aliens. I mean, I don't know what that seeming would be like. I mean, and in the seeming that Swinburne has in mind strikes me as more like that. It's like it's not. It couldn't be grounded in the seeming. It would have to be grounded in inference, right? It's too extended or something for it to be a mere seeming. And so I'm with you about that impulse. The other thing is he himself allows that our seemings could be counteracted by powerful evidence that God does in fact exist, right? So it might be that even though people have very powerful encounters with horrors of the worst kind, they also have evidences in the form of arguments or experiences or proper basicality or what have you that ground a kind of confidence in the existence of God that would make their belief rational, even though they were having these experiences and even though they didn't have a theodicy. So overall, I'm tempted by the view that theists can be rational in their theism even without having a theodicy.
All right, one more question and then we'll wrap up here.
Yeah.
When we're thinking about a theodicy, how do we measure its success?
I hate you for asking that, Jordan. I mean, it's tricky. I don't really know. I mean, maybe it's worth just seeing the kind of trickiness of the question, right? We've said that what it is to propose a theodicy is to attempt to make it plausible that God has good reasons for allowing each of the world's evils. But plausible to whom, right? And if take plausible to the diehard atheist, if that's the measure, I mean, almost all theodicies are going to fail, right? I mean, Peter Van Inwagen sort of nicely says that the way he thinks any philosophical argument works, including a theodicy, is it's successful only if it would move, think of it as a jury of fair-minded and uncommitted interlocutors, right? It would move them to this view, even in the face of the best arguments from the opposing side, right? So there's this, Van Inwagen gets up and makes his argument, then David Lewis makes his argument, then Van Inwagen, and the argument succeeds only if at the end of that this group has moved in one direction all the way or something. And he says, and I think rightly, no philosophical argument will do that. It's probably about right. I certainly don't think a theodicy is going to do it. So if a theodicy has to move neutral interlocutors to being completely on the side of the theist in the free will debate, then I think, okay, that's not. But look, Swinburne on his point of view says that like the reason that maybe this softens the blow of his demand for a theodicy is that he thinks, well, it's just to that person that it has to be plausible, right? And then they have to be reasonable, they have to be rational. But can a theist be reasonable, rational, consider the sort of theodicy that, say, Swinburne works out, and say, oh, that's good enough for me, I think it's plausible now. And if that's enough, well, then yeah, then there's probably some successful theodicies. So, and I think it's just a really open question, Jordan, who it is that has to be persuaded of the plausibility in order for the theodicy to be successful. It's just an open question.
All right. So we've reached the end. We've looked at the logical problem, the evidential problem, problem of divine hiddenness, now theodicies. There's this concluding chapter in your book where you get into some interesting other arguments like the problem of evil for atheism.
Yeah.
We don't have time to go into that. Maybe at some other point that'd be cool to do. But how would you like to conclude our discussion? And you don't have to feel limited just to theodicies. You can say overall what you'd like to conclude with.
Yeah. I should have something good to say here, Jordan. I don't know. I mean, this is maybe we sort of started on this theme, and maybe I'll just end on it. Like, I don't think this problem is solved by any means, um, and I don't want your viewers to get the impression that I think it's been solved, or um, I think it's the kind of thing that we have to spend our lives trying to get right. And I suppose that I just want to make this little point about that. Um, I don't find it surprising that, assuming theism is true, that we'd find ourselves with problems like these. I don't find that surprising. Um, and some of it has to do with that Hickeyan stuff about the kinds of creatures God would be trying to make of us. In And so I'll just note that I want to be maximally sympathetic to how powerful the argument is. I'm not trying to tell anybody that, in light of the problem of evil, they should stop being atheists. I think it's the most powerful family of arguments for atheism out there. And those theists who are sort of camping on the best versions of the problem of evil, I get it, right? I get it. Uh, Jordan, I'll just finish on this. It's been really great fun talking with you about these things. That's always a kind of an awkward thing to say when we're talking about the problem of evil. I don't want to make light of how serious it is. I hope that during our time together, we've been able to have a good time without making light of those things. And I do hope that your viewers will feel free to contact me with any questions. So I'm wide open. I'm easy to get a hold of at Loyola Marymount University, and always happy to think more about the problem of evil with anybody who's wrestling with the issues.
Well, thank you so much for spending several hours with me. I really, like you said, I don't mean enjoy as in to diminish this problem. It's a serious problem, but what I do mean is you've helped me to think more deeply about it and take it more seriously. And I think that the viewers who have watched all 4 videos will appreciate that and see that as well. So I'd encourage you, if you want a very good overview, introduction to this family of arguments, get the book. And I have several interviews that take a certain point that Dan's made and explore it in more depth. So check out the whole playlist of videos that I have on the problem of evil. All right. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.